Hi and welcome to Ljud Media. My name is Vasques Resolve. This is the Phantom 4K and this is the 4K VO. The biggest difference, apart from the size, is that in this camera you've only got a rolling shutter, and in this camera you've got a global shutter and a rolling shutter. So why use the Phantom? Well, when you want to shoot something in extreme high speed in 4K in uncompressed cine files, this is the best way to do it. There are positive and negative things on both cameras. The 4K Flex is good in situations where you want to film a lot of stuff a lot of times. You record, you choose your in and out points, you do playback, and you offload to the internal mag, you do the next shot. With the VO, you cannot use the cameras during the time you're offloading. You can look at pictures live, but you cannot record, you cannot test, you cannot do anything, you just see a live picture. During the VO, you offload directly to your computer, which takes longer. So it can take between 3 to 5 minutes, depending on how fast your computer is, to offload a full mag. This means during those 3 to 5 minutes, this camera is locked. This camera, you steer it through a portable computer, or you can steer it through Bluetooth and RCU. The remote control unit, as it's called. The VO, you steer through an iPad. This camera is a bit easier to work with. It does have it has an antenna on it, which makes it very sensitive to things that are around it. For example, in situations, I've worked with big cranes where this has been on the end of a crane, and sometimes the antenna can interfere with lots of metal objects and stuff like that around it. So this is a lot more sensitive to external stuff, whereas this one isn't. In this camera you can actually sync sound if you're shooting in 25 FPS. With this camera it's a bit more complicated syncing. One part that's extremely important on both these cameras is this camera is more made as a production camera, whereas the VO can also be put on things like the Bolt, and it has ways of configuring all the SDIs on the side here. You can have them as triggers, you can have them as Y and X axis is basically used for Bolt and VFX. Basically both the cameras are rated at 320. I think 800 is the sweet point. You cannot go over 800, otherwise things start getting noisy in the blacks. But you can work in 800 to get one more stop of light without a problem. In the VO, which is the smaller of the two cameras, you also have a global shutter. A global shutter means that the ISO is actually lifted a little bit. You can go up to about 1,000 before things start getting messy. A global shutter is also good for situations like strobe lamps, where you don't get the rolling shutter effect where lamps can get cut off in the middle of a frame. A very important fact about the Phantom, no matter which one you use, is that you should have a stable power source. The stable power source will affect the performance of the camera. And what I mean by that is that if the power cuts, the camera cuts. It doesn't have a hot swap function or anything like that. If you pull out the power, everything that's an internal mag disappears. So on the Phantom 4K, you will need to offload the cards through a card reader. This is the card reader, which is included, and this is connected to your portable computer. Also via 10 gigabit Ethernet. On the VO, you have the internal buffer, and then you actually offload through the Ethernet cable. In this case, we have 3 cables connected together, but a normal cable will be a plain Ethernet cable like you have at home. This cable on one side is connected to your computer and fast hard drives, and on the other side is connected directly to the camera. So basically, during the time that you've chose your in and out points on the internal, you can offload to your computer directly.
Is there anything else in these settings that think about when working with these cameras?
Well, a very important part of this camera is that you need to do a black reference as often as possible. Basically what a black reference does is it resets the sensor and it puts it back to its normal status again. If you do not do a black reference in the Phantom cameras, it's quite often when you offload the material you get black lines in it. Like the old man that I am, I need to put my glasses on now. Anything external, like for example Ethernet, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, that you need to connect something externally, needs to happen when you're booting the camera, otherwise the camera will not recognize it. So in the case of Ethernet, that's hot swappable, but in the case of the antenna, if I pull it out now, here's one I made earlier, I will lose connection with the iPad, and the only way I can get connection with the iPad again it again is by starting up the camera. All the Phantom cameras have an internal buffer. So basically what that means is that internally in the camera you have a circular buffer. So what is that? It's a memory. Quite simply, it's a memory. In the case of these two cameras, you have 5,000 frames. So you have 5,000 frames to play with. This internal memory, and this is something that you can go into more details, you can split up. So let's say you have 5,000 frames and you want to record 3 separate occasions during these 5,000 frames. You can split it up into 3 separate parts, or 2 separate parts, or 1 separate part, no matter how many times you want to do. What's most important to remember is the internal memory is what you record to, okay? What you decide to keep afterwards is what you export to your external memory. Now, your external memory is different depending on which camera you're working with. With this camera, as explained earlier, it has a mag. This process goes fast. You record in your internal buffer, you choose what you want, and you send it out to your external buffer, which is this one in this case, which is a card, which holds up to 2 terabytes of material. On the VO, you offload through 10 gigabits Ethernet. So you choose what you want, and then you offload through Ethernet, making it a lot more slower to work with. So how does the buffer work? Here's your internal buffer. It has 5,000 frames in it. How much you can film on this camera depends on exactly these 5,000 frames. So let's say I want to shoot 500 frames per second. If I shoot 500 frames per second, I'll be able to record for 10 seconds. So 5,000 divided by 500 is 10. That means I can shoot for 10 seconds. What does 10 seconds mean? 10 seconds at, in this case, 938 frames per second is 9,000, blah, 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 blah. We can keep on continuing counting, but the basic thing is that you can shoot 5,000 frames, and that's how many frames you have to play with afterwards. How does it record? You have a buffer, as I said earlier, with its 5,000 frames in. Here's frame number 1, and here's 5,000. The buffer is circularly recording the whole time. So when it gets to frame number 1, it starts recording over frame number 1 and just continues. Then you have something called a trigger. And what does a trigger do? It's an event that happens that you're trying to record. Could be someone flying through the air, it could be a dog shaking, it could be something exploding, watermelons I've seen hundreds of times, crashing on the thing. So what happens is that event will happen somewhere during the shoot. So you record continuously. You keep recording, and what happens is it shoots 1 frame, it records 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 5,000. When it gets to 5,000, it starts recording over the frames again. So when it gets to 5,000, it drops back to 1 and starts recording of them. When the event has happened in front of the camera, you press stop, and that's called the trigger. What happens then? You press the trigger here, for example. The event is here, and you press the trigger here. It has kept everything that has happened before I triggered. So if the event happens here, I get all the frames, all 5,000 frames before the event. So basically I can choose in and out points in my buffer. Say I want to have, let's say this is a watermelon falling on the ground. The watermelon explodes here, makes a mess. I have all the bits flying here, and I have the watermelon flying through the air here. So I choose my in and out points, and I offload that to my external mag. Now my external mag on the Phantom 4K is the card, which is inside of it, and in this case it's the Ethernet, which I record directly to my computer. This is what I offload to my external from the in and out points. During this time, I cannot use the camera for recording. I can set up shots, I can do stuff like that, but the camera is extremely sensitive. Where you set the trigger on the buffer is completely up to you. So I personally always set the trigger at the end, down here. Or should I say, I always set the trigger at the end, which means that it leaves everything that's left in the buffer. You can set the trigger at the end or the beginning. I can start the camera and it will record 5,000 frames and then stop. The problem with that is that if I miss the event, then it's already stopped. Whereas if I continuously record, I can always trigger and take the last 5,000 or depending on how I've split the mag, but in general, the last 5,000 frames that I've shot before I trigger the camera. At any point, when you're offloading the material, if the camera dies because of power shortage, you will lose what's in the internal buffer. That's just a said thing. If I go up to splitting the internal mag, of course, if I split the internal mag into two, I will have 2,500 frames I can record, and then another 2,500 frames I record. I can choose which one of these I offload. So let's say I split the internal mag of 5,000 into 2,500 and 2,500. I can record up to 2,500 frames here and then another 2,500 frames there. How do you split it? Well, depending on which camera you're using, on the VO, for example, you can choose in the menu how many segments you want to split the internal buffer up to. So I can split it up to 10. There are different types of flicker. There are flicker which is affected by the potency of the light, what kind of light it is, how strong it is. There's also something called rolling flicker, which has become a bit more common in the later years. And this is usually comes up when you're using big LED panels. So what you want to be able to do is you'll never be able to see flicker live. You have to look at the playback image. Why is that? Well, in 25 FPS, you should be able to see everything and there shouldn't be any flicker. In theory, there shouldn't be any flicker. We're going to be shooting in 900 or 600 frames, and then the frequency can end up wrong, and you might get flicker. What does that mean? Well, basically, you need to record and do playback to see if there is any flicker on the image. You cannot see it in a live image. So in this case, let's say we shoot in 600 frames. Okay, it's total darkness because there's not enough light here. But if I was to record this now, another indication you get on the screen is how your buffer is doing. A little red circle as well to say that you're recording. Now I've recorded my image, I stop it. I'll go into more details exactly how this works later. I'll do a little bit of playback. And then I'll look at my waveform and my histogram at the bottom of my screen to see if there's anything pumping up and down. That's a flicker. Any of the channels that are pumping up and down is a flicker, quite simply. The other flick you have is called a rolling flicker. That's nothing you can see with the naked eye. The only way you can see that is by pulling it into Davinci, doing a little grade, and checking the backgrounds, the flat backgrounds.
I want to show you quickly how to check for rolling flicker. When you're working with a VO, it's quite simple. You just take in a clip from your camera directly, just a short clip. Try and find an area which is a bit flatter, usually a clear wall or a background that's clear. You can also use skin tones if you have a lot of skin tones. You roll the material, and as you're rolling the material, you put in about 1.5 in contrast. I take away all the color. Turn that to 0. And then I do a very strong curve. This way, basically, I'm distinguishing between black and white. And I do a bit of playback. If there was any rolling shutter now, or rolling flicker, that would actually appear in the background here as lines going up in the background. It's quite uncommon to see rolling flicker nowadays. I've seen it in situations, for example, when sky panels are upside down, it can turn up. Also when using big LED panel sheets that are hanging. Certain places, like for example Filmhuset, has quite a big issue with rolling flicker. So this is one of the quickest ways to check. You can also use a leader meter. You can put your SDI signal through a leader, and you can check the signals through waveforms or other methods.
So basically I've set up the camera, I've got Ethernet connected. I also have BNC connected, and the information you get out on the screen here is basically how much you have left in the buffer. In this case, I was lying, it's 5,283 frames. How long you can record for? 3 minutes and 31 seconds. 3 minutes and 31 seconds is because we're shooting 25 frames per second. If I was to bump it up to 900, not only will the screen go black, for obvious reasons, there's not enough light, but you'll see the time, still 5,283 frames, but it's 5.8 seconds you can record for. If I was to partition up the internal mag that I explained earlier, this buffer would only show the first partition you're using, or the second, depending on where you are. So if I was to split the mag into two, you'd only have 2,500 frames and half the time to record in. What shutter angle you want to use is depending on what you want to achieve in your image. As with any camera, you can change the shutter angle depending on how much light you want. If you want to have a sharper image, then of course you have to put it down to 90 degrees. By putting it down to 90 degrees, you're also taking away half the light. A lot of photographers like to use tungsten. I'm not that bothered which lamps I use. You get less issues with bigger tungsten lamps than you do with smaller tungsten lamps. The 5Ks and the smaller lamps are usually quite sensitive to flicker. When it comes to HME lights, there you're a bit more flexible, and especially with the new LED lights, you can actually get away with quite a lot. Before a shoot, I usually discuss with the production what they're going to film. And the reason I do this is because I need to know what we're going to be filming. If it's a whole day of shooting and we're only shooting Phantom, then maybe I'll go with the 4K Flex. If it's just one or two shots, I'll go with the VO, because then I know I offload the material directly. I don't have to go through a mag. I don't have to have all the extras that are needed with offloading a 4K Flex. With the VO, I get the material directly into my computer. I can make as many copies as I want and see it directly, the original raw material in my computer. So this is the iPad control for the Phantom Flex VO. It's called iPhantom. It's an app you download, but of course it's included in all of Media's fantastic equipment. So this is how it works. Here you have your setup. This is your record screen. You can change the frame rate and stuff like that on this screen to whatever you want. You have the white balance, what ISO you want to have it, also resolution. Loop mode means that you're continuously recording. You can also have a stop and start if you want, like a normal camera. So here you have to control your on-screen displays, and then the BREF is what I was talking about before. This is your black reference. On the PC, the system is a little bit different, but right now we're going to go through the iPad, which is VO, the main one. To start recording, you press record, quite simply. Now the buffer is filling. It's going to come up to its 5,000 frames, do the loop, like I explained before, and keep recording. What I have here is the trigger. So when what's happened on screen and I'm interested in catching, I press the trigger, and then I go to playback mode. In playback, I can look at the monitor in the background, see what clips I'm interested, what part of the clip I'm interested in having, mark the in point, find the end of the clip, mark the out point. Now when I go to the Phantom software, the Phantom Fuse software on my computer, it will only have the in and out points of this clip, not the complete clip. If I decide not to have a mark in, and a mark out, I take them away, then I'll get the entire clip if I'm going to offload. All 5,238 frames. Also available on here, you've got the menu. Here you can change other settings in the camera, like for example, where the trigger position is, if you want to put it at the beginning of the clip or at the end of the clip. You can also change how many partitions you want. If you want to partition up the internal mag. Also the playback. This is very important because this is the base in which the camera will be offloaded afterwards. So if you're shooting in a PAL region, you need to do in 25. If you're shooting in NTSC like the US, you need to have 2398. And this is where you change it. You change your output format, but it also changes the base of your camera. We want to shoot in 25p. There we have that, 1080 25p. This is just the output, but it also affects the base of the camera, the recording frame rate. Also here is something I haven't really gone through, and that's called the log mode. On the Phantom Flex VO, you have two log modes. Now, technically speaking, log mode is, like with other cameras, it's a way of recording as much information as possible on any camera. Like the Alexa, you have log, so to get as much information as possible. The Phantom Flex, they are a 12-bit linear camera. The reason you have log on these cameras is to be able to check certain values when you're looking at the playback. So what I usually do is when I'm unsure of how the highlights are looking or how the shadows are looking, I will put it into log 2 mode. And this basically helps to check out the highlights in the image. So personally, I usually shoot in Rec 709, and if I need to get to the log files, I can do that afterwards in Davinci Resolve. We are, after all, shooting in uncompressed RAW. So here we have the Rec 709. This is what we shoot at, and this is what we work with. When you're using Phantom Fuse, which is the software that I recommend when working with Phantom, and which is installed in all of Udembil's Mac Pros that you borrow, Phantom Fuse basically acts like an external drive. So if, for example, I wanted to change the name, I can go into Phantom Fuse and actually change the real name to something else, like, for example, let's call it X001. And then it will remount as X001. There you have it, X001. It's still the same clip, it just has a different naming. This is just a practical thing. Phantom Fuse works in the background of your software. It's a background program. It ends up in the toolbar up here. You can have it as an extra down in your toolbar at the bottom as well. A shout out to Automatic and Ben, who has created the Phantom Fuse software. It's very cheap and has changed the way that you work with Phantom, all types of Phantom. So anyway, let's go on to how you work with material in Davinci Resolve. So here's my cine file. I drag it into onto my media storage. I can see the file. We have shot in Rec 709. I was talking about this before. So basically, what would you use log for in this camera? Now, normally when you work with log, it's to get as much information from the camera as possible. As there is no standard LUT or way of reading the raw files in DaVinci the same way that you would with Alexa or Sony, where you can pull forward a log file and you can already implement a Rec 709 of it. I suggest you work with Rec 709 and then you work backwards. You change the Rec 709 to something that's a bit more, something you can handle a bit better. So in the settings, I go for the camera raw. I leave everything, I reset everything. I go to the camera metadata, I choose the project. I choose the SMPT timecode, or as it's standard inside of the camera. I keep it on Rec 709. Something that's very important to pick up here is the contrast in Phantom is very strong. So when you look at the image in the beginning, it looks like it's very high contrast. So I usually pull down the contrast about -40. This gives me a bit more of a log image, but not completely. Then I'll put this in a timeline or work with it however I want to work with. In my timeline, you still see the clip and everything's working fine. Then, now when I'm working in the color tab, this is where I start. If you want to, if for example you're working with Arri Alexa, let's say we work with the Arri Alexa Mini, okay? Because the sensor is pretty much the same size and that's the way we want to go. The Arri Alexa Mini works in a log C3 color space. So what we need to do is convert our Rec 709 color space from the Phantom to the log C3 of Arri Alexa. How do you do that? In my case, I add a node, quick serial node. Then I go down and I check in the effects here. In the effects, I look for a transform, color space transform. I pull that in. As our input color space is Rec 709, we go to Rec 709, which should be here somewhere. Our input gamma is also Rec 709. This is coming directly from the files directly. So you need to find that, Rec 709. Then our output, we go to Arri Alexa. So in this case, we go to the Arri Y Gamut 3 because we want to try and match it towards an Alexa Mini. And then the log C3 space. And what you're left with is an image which is very similar to Alexa when it comes out the camera. How can I prove this? I'll add a node to it. And then on top of that, we'll add the log C to Rec 709 LUT. And there you have it. Now you're working with footage that similar to Arri Alexa. It makes it a lot easier to match it in the end. The actual size of the sensor, as I mentioned before, is exactly the same. If you're shooting with 4K Phantom Flex in full resolution, it's the same as shooting with an Arri 35 or Alexa 35 and using the 16:9 mode. This is how I usually work with Phantom material, and then I can start grading as I normally would. So what can I say? This tutorial or 101 on Phantom is something that I've been meaning to do for the last 10 years or so, but I've never got around to it. Now I have the opportunity, and all I can say, since starting in 2007, 2006 with Kenny Starfighter working as a DIT, right through a couple of weeks ago when I did my last job, it's been a fun journey. It's been amazing. I've learned and met a lot of cool people, been to a lot of cool places, and basically had fun in an industry which will have a big place in my heart for the rest of my life. So that's a wrap from me. Bye-bye. So you connect the camera like this. There. Det är klart.